Okay, let's consider how this course is structured. A frequent objection to Al Gore's milestone 2006 film An Inconvenient Truth was that it principally explained the problem rather than offered solutions to the climate crisis, as it provided little direction on how to solve this extraordinary problem. More than a few people found the film, well, depressing. Some even felt hopeless after viewing it, which was certainly understandable. After all, on what were we to pin our hopes? What could avert, or at least mitigate, the climate crisis? Gore offered very little to go on, and thus very little hope. In fairness, given that the film ran for just under 2 hours, Gore was able to do quite a bit in a short period of time. He certainly energized a generation of activists, like filmmaker Kip Anderson, as he explains in the opening of Cowspiracy. Nonetheless, An Inconvenient Truth is something of a cautionary tale for anyone wishing to communicate the extraordinary challenge that the climate crisis presents for humanity. Climate Crisis 101 humbly both takes up this formidable challenge of 1. Communicating the climate crisis, as well as 2. Exploring the challenges we face in mitigating the crisis. As An Inconvenient Truth made clear, both challenges are indeed formidable and interconnected. So why didn't Gore communicate more solutions? In part, he arguably didn't because they were still being worked out in detail across the globe in 2006, even though, at the time, we had known for over 40 years that we needed to make changes like switching to renewable energy, such as photovoltaic and wind power. Moreover, we largely had the necessary technology in the 1970s. However, as far as their day-to-day lives are concerned, a climate-friendly lifestyle seemed, to be honest, like something of an oddity. Again, this is not to say that people hadn't been developing and advocating for such a lifestyle for 50 years, as environmental vegetarianism, and that's eating a largely plant-based diet for environmental reasons, for example, is certainly that old. Part of the problem was that we were still in something of a state of denial. This is not to say that Gore's audience was denying that the crisis was real. While it was unfortunately the case that many Americans were denying the crisis in 2006, the people that filled theaters to watch An Inconvenient Truth likely acknowledged that there was a problem. At least by the end of the film, they certainly did. But this is a different sort of denial that our lives would have to change in order to avert the crisis. Many people were, and still are, hoping that a new kind of car, perhaps a hybrid or fully electric one, or buying organic food would solve the problem. Michael Pollan's The Omnivore's Dilemma also came on the scene in 2006. But they weren't at all prepared for the fact that we would have to forgo owning cars altogether and radically rethink the way that we eat. Pastured beef may arguably be better for the planet than feedlots, but a far bigger problem is that we eat beef at all. It's not that Gore and his audience were denying the validity of the climate crisis. They were just arguably in a state of denial when it came to personally addressing the problem. Gore himself repeatedly came under fire for his personal failure to do so. It is, in fact, difficult to understand how a Nobel laureate for his work on the climate crisis would be okay with crisscrossing the globe in a private jet. Climate Crisis 101 takes the position that we both need to stop denying that personal changes will be necessary, as well as stop delaying implementing them. Once we open ourselves to the fact that we need to make changes to our way of life, we are suddenly presented with scores of things that we can do to help mitigate the climate crisis. Big and little things that we can together do that will reduce our size 10 climate footprint down to size 1. And I don't just mean this figuratively. As we shall see, it's literally possible for Americans to reduce our individual climate footprints by a factor of 10 and still live meaningful and happier lives. Arguably more meaningful and happier lives. The needed changes are both individual and collective. Hence, there are things that we can do by ourselves, such as switching to a largely plant-based diet, and things that we can only do collectively through activism and political action, like enacting a Green New Deal. These changes form the basis of Climate Crisis 101. In other words, in some ways, Climate Crisis 101 is less about climate change than it is about human change, how we human beings, both individually and collectively, need to change. Consequently, and in contrast to An Inconvenient Truth, which focused on the problem, Climate Crisis 101 focuses on solutions. This is not to say that we gloss over the problem, but rather that we only devote about a third of the course to it. Here is how Climate Crisis 101 proceeds, which should, I hope, further explain its underlying rationale. Climate Crisis 101 is divided into 10 sections, which corresponds to the 10 weeks that Climate Crisis 101 is taught at UCSB. Note that these sections are different than the chapters. The first 3 of 10 sections are devoted to the problem. Section 1 focuses on the problem by considering how the climate crisis is a global phenomenon already impacting the entire planet. Moreover, as we explore in this section, this is just the beginning, as the worst is yet to come. How bad will it be? It all depends on how quickly and decisively we act. Section 2 brings things closer to home as we look at how the crisis is already having a real impact on us locally. Since this course is taught in California, the focus is on how the crisis is unfolding here, including Santa Barbara in particular. This is an important section as it underscores that the worldwide crisis will be experienced very differently across the globe. Section 3 takes up the question of climate change denial and delay, which is greatly exacerbating the problem and, in fact, making the problem far worse. If we resolve to take the required actions, we can avert the worst of what is yet to come. Unfortunately, the fossil fuel industry and other interests are devoted to thwarting those actions. 3 weeks are not a lot to devote to the problem. We could easily spend the whole course on this, indeed multiple courses. But this brings us back to Gore's challenge with An Inconvenient Truth. A course devoted to the problem would offer little hope for the future. In fact, when this course was taught for the first time, during the first 3 weeks, many students were already becoming depressed and, indeed, I think it's fair to say, despairing. After reading their weekly comments, I found myself repeatedly reassuring them that there was hope and that we would get to it soon. And there is hope, lots of it. The final 7 sections are devoted to it. Section 4 introduces, by way of Henry David Thoreau and the modern movement of minimalism, how lifestyle choices and personal action can have a profound impact on our individual climate footprint. Section 5 not only takes a look at the environmental impact of the past 60 years on consumer culture, but also the social justice issues that it created. Section 6 looks at the top 25 sources of greenhouse gas emissions and considers how important individual personal action is to many. In particular, we look at how limiting food waste and switching to largely plant-based diets are altogether more important than either wind or solar energy in reducing GHG emissions. Note that sections 4 to 6 focus on personal action. I agree with Naomi Klein that focusing on individual behavior, whether it's changing light bulbs or going vegan, is just not going to get us there. However, as we shall see, it is not a question of choosing either personal action or activism or becoming politically active. In many cases, all 3 are integrally connected and desperately needed. Personal action has a personal position as it can, a special position, as it can help us focus on the prize on a daily basis. Every time that we hop on a bike or forego a burger, we remind ourselves that much is needed to be done and that we are, even if in small ways, doing something. Doing such little things also sends a message to the rest of the world as we lead by example. However, Naomi Klein is right in that this isn't enough, which is why we need 2 sections of Climate Crisis. Next 2 sections of Climate Crisis 101 are devoted to activism, political action, and the challenge of communicating climate change. Section 7 underscores the importance of climate activism and political action. In particular, the focus will be on the Green New Deal, as it promises sweeping political, economic, and cultural changes in response to the climate crisis. Although it is presently not being enacted, it represents the most reasonable response to the climate crisis that is yet to be put forth by politicians in the U.S. Section 8 focuses on the importance of communication. In addition to personal action, activism, and being politically active, it's important for each of us to communicate to others the urgency of the climate crisis and what can be done about it. This is often far easier said than done. Section 9 takes up what may seem to be an odd question. Can the climate crisis make us happy? In no way do I mean to be insensitive here, as I realize that millions of people are already suffering because of the climate crisis, and that this is just the beginning, as billions, and that's billions with a B, will ultimately suffer. In response to this suffering, this course takes a long, hard look at the current consumerist iteration of the American dream and how it is not just an environmental and social justice nightmare, but it also has taken its toll on the American psyche. The problem is this consumerist dream promises happiness. It's not at all delivered on this promise. In fact, in recent decades, Americans have become less and less happy. While this would be a sad irony in itself, the great tragedy here is that in pursuing happiness in this way, we are destroying their planet. During the same period that Americans have becoming less happy, we have been pumping more and more greenhouse gases into our planet's atmosphere. Not only could profoundly reevaluating and reducing consumerism make us happier, it could reduce suffering in many wealthy countries now, as well as the rest of the world, as billions of people are moving out of poverty. Section 10 concludes the course by considering how we can make a difference in the world in light of what we have learned. By ending on an optimistic, indeed happy note, my goal was to make clear that not only is there hope for the future, but it can be a far better, happier future than the present, or, for that matter, any point in human history. How do we bring about such a future? The majority of this course is devoted to what each of us can do to realize that future.